Leora kept her eyes on the black stone floor as the back of Liliana's hand split her lip, because looking up was a privilege servants in Varkhold Keep had never been granted. A single drop of her blood fell and bloomed against the polished obsidian dark on dark, where 7 generations of kings had walked to the throne. She damaged it, Liliana said, holding up the broken clasp of a necklace worth more than every servant in the hall would earn in 3 lifetimes. Look at her, she doesn't even have the grace to weep.
The hall had been dressed for the Alpha King's birthday feast banners, the color of dried wine, candle smoke curling toward the rafters, the long tables already groaning under silver. Nobles paused with cups halfway to their mouths and watched the way people watch a dog being beaten, some with discomfort, more with idle amusement. A lord near the dais laughed and said the girl ought to be whipped in the yard so the lesson would take properly. Leora did not weep. She had learned years ago that tears only earned a second blow, so she pressed her tongue to the cut inside her mouth and counted her breaths until it would be over. She was no one. She had no surname, no family, no line in any record but the servant's ledger found as an infant among the ashes of a fire no one would explain to her. Everyone in that hall knew exactly what she was worth, and the number was nothing. Not one of them knew that the throne behind Liliana, the dead cold throne, whose ancient sigil had not answered a living hand in 412 years, had been waiting for the very girl bleeding on its floor. They struck her in a palace that the law, had the law not been buried, would have named her own. And above them all, unseen on the gallery stair, the Alpha King had stopped to watch. A servant refused to fall. The corridor that led down to the servants' quarters was colder than the hall, and Leora was grateful for it. Cold did not laugh at her. Cold did not hold up a broken clasp and call it her crime. She went down the worn steps with one hand against the wall, past the kitchens where the ovens never fully died, and let the dark swallow the shape of her until she was only another shadow carrying coal. That was the truth of her days. Before the sky paled, she was already on her knees at the great hearths raking out the ash of the night, before hauling the heavy scuttles up stairways built for lords who would never carry anything heavier than a cup. She blacked the grates. She scrubbed the long tables until her knuckles cracked. She carried wine to men who looked through her as though she were a draft in the room, and she carried their insults back down to the cellars where no one could see her swallow them. She had no name beyond the one the old cook had given her as a child, Leora, and nothing after it. In the keep's records, she was a single line in a cramped hand servant, female, no kin. The older women said she had been found the winter the East Village burned an infant lying in the cooling ash of a house, with no walls left standing untouched, while everything around her had gone to cinder. They said it the way people say a thing they do not quite believe, and their eyes would drift to her hands when they thought she could not see, because her hands were the strange part. Leora had learned long ago not to flinch when she lifted a coal that had rolled loose onto the stone, not to cry out when she pressed a fallen ember back into the grate with her bare fingers. The heat would reach her and then somehow seem to decide against her. She had stopped wondering at it. A servant who asked questions about herself only handed other people a reason to be rid of her. Above the cellars, in rooms kept warm by those same fires, Liliana of the Marrowgate clan was deciding the shape of the kingdom's future. And the future she wanted held only one throne and one woman beside it. She was beautiful the way a drawn blade is beautiful, and she had spent years making herself necessary to the court. A word dropped here, a favor pushed there, a rival quietly unmade. She meant to be queen, beside Corvin, the Alpha King, and she had decided this so completely that she treated anyone standing between her and that crown as already beaten. A servant girl was nothing to her. That was precisely why she struck them. Nothing could be struck without cost. Leora knew none of Liliana's designs. She knew only the bruise rising along her jaw and the small, stubborn dreams she allowed herself when the other women were asleep, that somewhere there was a life in which a person might look at her and see the whole of her and not look away. She did not know that she had already been seen. High in the keep, in a chamber lit by a single low lamp, the Alpha King stood at a window above the dark courtyards and did not sleep. Corvin had gone out to the gallery that evening to oversee nothing in particular, and had instead watched a noblewoman split a servant's lip over a clasp and watched the servant refuse to go down. He had said nothing then. A king who came down into his own hall to shield a coal girl would only have painted a target on her by morning. But before he left the gallery, he had found the captain of his guard and told him low and plain that the girl who tended the great hearths was not to be touched again while he drew breath, and that the order was to be obeyed without his name ever spoken near it. The captain had not asked why. Had he asked, Corvin was not certain he could have answered in any way that made sense to a man who had not lived it. He had not always been a king. Years before the crown, before its weight taught him to keep his face as still as stone, he had ridden alone into the forest behind Varkold and set his boot wrong among the leaves, and the rusted iron of a poacher's trap had closed on his leg and pinned him to the ground like a snared animal. He had bled there through a night and most of a day, fevered half out of his mind, certain he would die a fool's death within sight of his own walls. A girl had found him. Thin, soot-smudged, hardly more than a child herself, she had levered the trap open with a fallen branch and her two small hands, and had not once asked who he was or what he might give her. She had bound his leg with strips torn from the hem of her own dress. She had carried him water in cupped palms and pressed on him the half of a hard crust that was plainly all the food she owned, as though feeding a bleeding stranger were the most ordinary act in the world. When the fever broke and he finally slept, she was gone, the way the poor learn to be gone before anyone can accuse them of having been somewhere they should not. He never learned her name. For years he had carried the memory of those hands that had gripped hot iron to free him and had not seemed to mind the burn. He had told himself the girl at the hearths only resembled her. He had told himself a great many things. The feast burned down to its embers near midnight. The musicians were paid and gone. The nobles carried off to their beds, heavy with wine, and the great throne hall fell silent but for the hiss of dying torches. It was then the steward came to find Leora, who had let herself believe the day was finally finished with her, and told her the king's hall must be spotless by dawn, alone. As punishment, Liliana had specified for the matter of the necklace. So she carried her bucket and her rags up into the vast cold room where she was never otherwise permitted to linger, and she began to scrub. The black stone drank the lamplight and gave nothing back. She worked her way across the floor toward the dais, toward the throne itself, where a film of soot from the night's torches had settled into the ancient carving set into the stone at its foot, a great circular sigil. Lines coiled within lines that the older servants would not walk past without lowering their eyes. The founder's mark, they called it, though no living soul had seen it do anything but gather dust. It had been dead for 412 years. Everyone knew that. Leora knelt at the edge of it. She was too tired for fear. She wet her rag and set her bare palm flat against the cold carved stone to steady herself, and leaned in to wipe the soot from the deepest groove. The stone was no longer cold beneath her hand. She felt it before she understood it, a warmth waking in the rock, as though something underneath had turned in a long sleep and opened a single eye. A thin thread of red light traced itself along the groove beneath her fingers, then jumped to the next, and the next, racing the carved channels outward, faster than thought, until the whole vast sigil stood blazing crimson in the dark and threw her shadow huge across the far wall. By the doors, a guard cried out. Another dropped his torch, and it guttered on the stone. The red fire did not scorch the rock, did not burn her hand. It only poured up out of the founder's mark like blood, remembering an old wound, 412 years late, beneath the palm of a girl with no name, no kin, and no place in any record that had ever been allowed to matter. By morning, the story had outrun every messenger in Varkhold. The dead mark had wakened. A servant had set it burning. The throne hall still smelled faintly of hot iron, though the fire had long since sunk back into the stone. By the time the sun cleared the eastern wall, the great hall was crowded to its pillars, with everyone in the keep who had blood enough to claim a place there and a good many who did not. Leora stood at the center of it, exactly where she least wished to be, with the whole weight of the court's stare pressing on her bowed shoulders. She had not slept. She had spent the rest of the night locked in an antechamber, under guard, listening to men argue on the far side of the door about whether she was a miracle or a crime. Corvan sat the throne and let them argue. He had learned that a king who spoke first told the room what he feared. So he watched still as carved oak, while one after another, the great men of the kingdom came forward to lay their hands upon the founder's mark. Lord Hargreave went first, who traced his line back 9 generations and never let anyone forget it. He pressed his broad palm to the carving and waited, jaw set certain. Nothing answered him. The stone stayed cold and gray. An old priest came after, murmuring the half-remembered rites, and laid trembling fingers in the deepest groove, and the sigil ignored him, as it had ignored every hand for 412 years. One by one they came, lords, clan heads, a captain of the guard who had no business trying and could not help himself, and one by one the mark turned them all away. "This proves nothing," Liliana said. She had dressed for the morning as though for a coronation, and she moved through the hall like a woman already certain of the verdict. "Or it proves the obvious. The creature used some forbidden craft on the stone last night. Witchery on the founder's own mark. There is no other account of it that does not insult every soul of true blood in this room." A murmur went through the nobles, low and ugly, the sound of a crowd being handed a conclusion it wanted. Leora felt it settle on her like cold water. She knew that sound. It was the sound that came just before a punishment. "Then let it be settled plainly," Corvan said. It was the first time he had spoken, and the hall went quiet at once. He rose from the throne and came down the dais steps, and he did not look at Liliana. He looked at Leora, and for the length of a breath, there was something in his face that did not belong to a king at all. "Touch it again," he said. Leora's mouth was dry. "Your Majesty, I never meant. I know what you did not mean." His voice was low-pitched for her, and not the crowd, though the crowd strained to catch it. "Touch the stone. If it stays dark, this woman has her answer, and I will hear no more of witchery. If it does not..." He let the sentence stand open. "Then we will all of us have a longer day than we planned." She did not want to. Every instinct a servant owns told her to keep her hands at her sides and her eyes on the floor, and to make herself small until the danger passed over. But the king was waiting, and the court was waiting, and there was nowhere left to hide. She crossed the cold floor on legs that did not feel like hers, and knelt and laid her bare palm flat against the founder's mark in front of them all. The stone woke under her hand like something glad to be touched. Red light leapt the carved channels faster than any eye could follow, racing outward in a great wheel of fire until the whole hall stood washed in crimson, and every upturned face was painted the color of coals. And this time, the light did not stop at the floor. It climbed the dais. It threaded up through the seams of the black stone behind the throne, and for the space of a few heartbeats, letters surfaced there, an inscription in a hand older than the kingdom's oldest book, burning bright and then fading before any scholar in the room could do more than gasp at the shape of it. Then it was gone, and the hall was gray again, and Leora knelt in a silence so complete she could hear her own pulse in her ears. Lord Hargreave had gone the color of ash. The old priest had sunk to his knees. And Liliana, who an hour before had stood so certain of the verdict, stared at the kneeling servant girl with an expression Leora had never once seen on her face. Not contempt, not anger, but the white, fixed look of a person watching the floor of her own future crack open. "Whatever this is," Corvan said into the silence, "she is now under my protection. Personally, let any hand raised against her answer to mine." He did not give the court time to object. He never learned in all the years after whether that was wisdom or only the same recklessness that had once sent him alone into the forest. But he made the decree, and he made it in front of every witness who mattered. And in doing so, he changed the shape of every life in the room, most of all his own. In the days that followed, Leora discovered that royal protection was its own strange kind of imprisonment. She was given a room with a window, the first she had ever had, and clean clothes and food she did not have, to steal moments to eat. She was also given the king's questions, and there was no end to them. They worked in the archive tower, because that was where the answers had to be if answers existed anywhere. It was a tall, dust-choked room full of ledgers no one had opened in lifetimes, and in the evenings when the court's eyes were elsewhere, Corvin would climb the winding stair and find her already there. Among the records, a lamp at her elbow stood on her fingers from a different kind of work than she had ever done before. "You read," he said the first night, and could not quite keep the surprise from it. "The old cook taught me letters." Leora did not look up from the ledger. She said a girl who could read could at least know when she was being cheated. He almost smiled. He had not expected that, and he was a man who prided himself on expecting things. He taught her the history of Varkold as they searched the founding of the keep, the long line of kings, the wars that had shaped the borders, the careful chronicle a kingdom keeps of itself. And Leora listened, and then, to his constant astonishment, she argued. When he told her the founders had handed their power willingly to the first kings, she set her finger on a gap in the dates and asked why a thing given willingly left no record of the giving. When he repeated what every child in the kingdom was taught, she asked who had written the lesson and what they had to gain by it. "You question everything," he said one night, half in complaint. "I question things that were told to me by people who profited from my believing them." She closed the ledger. "Forgive me, Your Majesty. It is a habit I learned downstairs. Down there, when a noble tells you a thing is for your own good, it never is." He was quiet a moment. "And up here, I have not decided yet." She meant it as armor, and he heard it as honesty, and something between them shifted that neither of them named. It would have been easier if he had been cruel. It would have been far easier if she had been able to keep hating the men of the court as a single faceless thing, instead of finding that one of them sat across a lamp from her in the small hours and listened. Actually listened when she spoke. There was a pull in the room on those nights, a thing she had no word for, that seemed to lean the two of them toward each other across the cluttered table, even as both of them sat very still and pretended it was only the lateness of the hour. She told herself it was foolishness. He was the Alpha King. She was a girl found in ashes. There was no story in the world where that ended in anything but grief, and she had grief enough already. But while they bent their heads over old ink in the tower, Liliana was not idle. She had recovered quickly from the shock of the hall, as a clever person does, by deciding that the impossible was simply a problem to be solved. If the Mark had chosen the girl, then the Mark and the girl were both threats, and threats were managed the way Liliana had always managed them, quietly, patiently, and through other people's hands. She went to the elder clans, the old families, whose grandfathers had grandfathers in the keep, and she spoke to their pride. A nameless servant burning the founder's mark, she told them, was not a wonder. It was an insult. It was the beginning of the end of everything that made their blood worth more than a Cole girl's, and if they did not act, they would deserve what came. The accusations began like a draft under a door. Leora had bewitched the king. Leora had murdered the true heir, whose place she meant to steal. Leora was no Ashbourne miracle, but a poisoner, a thief, a thing that should be put down before it spread. None of it could be traced to Liliana. All of it carried her shape. Then the accidents started. A stair Leora climbed every evening was found one morning with its top stone worked loose so that a careless foot would have sent her down the full height of the tower. A cup of wine, sent up to her room with a steward's compliments, turned a stray cat, stiff and cold by midnight, and the steward swore under questioning that the order had come from a voice in a dark corridor he could not name. Each time by chance, or by the captain's new diligence, the harm missed her. Each time it came a little closer, and in the archive the records began to disappear. It was Elder Maeve who noticed it, a small, sharp old woman who had kept the keep's chronicle for 40 years and knew her ledgers the way a shepherd knows a flock. She came to Corvan with her hands shaking not from age and laid an empty binding on the table between them. "The ledger of the founding years," she said. "The true one beneath the copies. It was here a fortnight past. Now there is the cover and nothing within." She looked from the king to the servant girl and back, and her old face was gray. "Your Majesty, I have read the keep's records since before your father wore the crown. There is a pattern to how a thing is erased, which pages go first, how the gaps are dressed to look like ordinary loss. I have seen this hand before." She tapped the empty binding. "Not done by anyone living. Done 412 years ago, to bury whatever happened then. And now someone in this keep is doing it again, the very same way, to bury whatever is happening now." The lamp guttered between them. Outside the tower window, the dark pressed close, and somewhere below, in the sleeping keep, a person who feared the truth more than any blade was already deciding how much they were willing to burn to keep it. Elder Maeve did not sleep for 3 nights after she found the empty binding. She set the younger archivists to copying by day so no one would mark her absence, and by lamplight she went down into the parts of the tower no one had reason to visit, the lowest vault, where the keep stored the records of records, the indexes and crossmarks that told a reader where a thing had once been kept, even after the thing itself was gone. A clever erasure could burn a page. It was far harder to burn the memory of where the page had been. It was in that low vault behind a false panel that her own predecessor's predecessor had built, and told no one of that she found what 412 years had been arranged to hide. She brought it to the king at the darkest part of the night, and she asked that the servant girl be brought too, and when Corvan saw her face, he did not argue. They gathered in the archive by a single shielded lamp, the king, the old archivist, and Leora, who stood with her arms wrapped around herself, as though the tower had grown suddenly cold. "You were not found in the ashes of an accident," Maeve said to her. She said it gently, the way one delivers news that will undo a life. "The East Village did not burn by chance the winter you were left in it. It was the last hiding place of a line the kingdom was told had died, and someone meant to end it there in the fire, as the rest of it had been ended. 412 years before. They counted the dead, and they counted wrong. A house burned to its foundation, and in the cold ash of it, untouched, there was a child the flames would not take. Leora's voice came out very small. You are saying I am no one's child. I already knew that. I am saying you are the only living child of the Founder's own blood. Maeve laid the recovered pages on the table, brittle and brown. The ink faded, but legible to an eye that had spent 40 years learning to read what time had tried to take. The Ashborn, the first line, the ones who raised the Founder's mark and set it in the stone and bound it to their own blood so that the throne of Varkold would always know its true heir by touch alone and could never be claimed by force or lie. They did not vanish. They were removed. 412 years ago, there was a call it what it was, a theft. The Ashborn were killed or driven out, their records, burned, their very name turned into a children's tale, and the families that did the killing took the throne and called it inheritance. The lamp threw their shadows long up the shelves. Leora looked at the pages and could not make herself touch them. Then the kings, she said slowly, all the kings since, yours. She looked at Corvin for the first time since Maeve had begun. Your fathers, they were guardians. It was Corvin who answered, and his voice was not steady. He had taken up one of the brittle pages and was reading it, and Leora watched the blood leave his face as he read. Not by their own telling, by this one. He set the page down as though it had burned him after all. The Founders left a charge in the stone, Maeve says, and this confirms it. The line that held the throne after the Ashborn were taken was never meant to keep it. They were set as wardens to hold the seat to keep the kingdom whole until the Ashborn blood returned to wake the mark and take back what was always theirs. He looked up, and there was something close to grief in it. My house has sat a borrowed throne for 400 years and called it ours. And the mark has been waiting all this time for the only hand it would ever truly answer to. He looked at her hand when he said it, the hand that did not burn. For a long moment, no one spoke. The enormity of it filled the small room like rising water. Leora, who had carried coal, who had been struck over a clasp not a fortnight past, who had taught herself letters so that no one could cheat her without her knowing, was the lawful heir to the throne of Varkold. And every soul who had ever looked through her as if she were a draft in the room had been bowing to a chair that belonged to her. She should have felt something grander than what she felt. What she felt, standing there, was cold and frightened and very far from home. Who else knows? She asked. In the keep, living only the three of us. Maeve's old eyes moved to the dark beyond the lamplight. And whoever has been burning the pages to keep it that way. It should have bound the three of them closer, a secret like that shared in the dark. Instead, it was the thing that broke them. Leora did not sleep either that night, and somewhere in the long gray hours before dawn, the shock began to curdle into a colder thought. She turned the king's words over and over, and the more she turned them, the worse they sat. He had known. Not all of it she could believe. He had not known all of it, but he had known enough. He had a memory of a girl in a forest with hands that did not burn. He had set a guard over the coal girl at the hearths before the mark ever woke, before there was any throne or bloodline in it, and he had told the captain to keep his name out of the order. Why would a king do that for a servant, unless he had already wondered? Unless he had been watching her and weighing her and saying nothing. By the time the sun came up, she had built the whole of it into a shape she could not put down. When Corvin came to find her, she met him with it. You knew what I might be. She did not bow. She had stopped bowing. Before the mark woke, you set a guard over me weeks ago. You never said a word. I set a guard over you because I watched a woman split your lip and I could not get the sight of it out of my head. He took a step toward her and stopped when she stepped back. Leora, don't. Her voice shook, and she hated that it shook. You protected me. You brought me up here. You gave me a room with a window. You sat with me every night and let me argue with you. And the whole time you were measuring me against an old story to see whether I was the heir who could give your house a clean conscience. The mark is a key, Maeve said. To you, I was a lock that needed opening. She pressed the heel of her hand to her mouth and made herself stop. Was any of it for me? Or was it all for the throne, for making the theft your family lived on look like a gift you chose to give back? That is not... He stopped. He was a king. He was not used to defending himself, and he did it badly, which only made it worse. I did not bring you here for the throne. The throne is the last thing I want to think of when I am with you, and that frightens me more than any of this. And your ancestors, she pressed on, because the wound was open now, and she could not stop pulling at it. Maeve's own pages, the line that held the seat after the Ashbourne were taken. Wardens, you said. But who is to say your fathers did not learn somewhere across 400 years exactly whose throne they were sitting, and decide it was easier to keep the secret than to give it back? How do I know your house was guarding the truth and not guarding the lie? He had no answer for that. The terrible thing was that he had asked himself the same question in the dark and had not been able to answer it either. The records that might have cleared his father's were the very records that had been burned. He could swear his own innocence. He could not swear theirs, and he was too honest to pretend the difference away. I don't know, he said at last quietly. I have not had 400 years to read. I have had 3 nights the same as you. I cannot prove to you that my blood is clean. I can only tell you what I am and ask you to weigh that instead. But I see that my word is the cheapest thing in this room to you right now. It was the right thing to say, and it landed wrong the way true things often do when a heart has already decided to mistrust. Leora heard in it only a king who could not deny the charge, and so asked to be judged on charm instead of fact. She turned away from him, and the small warm thing that had been growing between them in the lamplight of the tower went cold, and both of them felt it go, and neither knew how to call it back. Liliana, who missed nothing, saw the frost between them within a day, and she fed it the way one feeds a fire that has only just caught. She could not yet move openly against a girl the mark had chosen, but she could whisper. She found Leora alone in a corridor and was for once almost kind, which was worse than her cruelty. You poor creature, she said. You truly believed he wanted you. A king does not lie beside the woman who proves his whole family are thieves and call it love. He keeps her close so he can manage what she knows. The moment your truth costs him more than your company is worth, you will learn exactly what you are to him. She smiled and let it sink and walked on. And to the elder clans, she said the opposite with the same tongue. The girl had turned the king against his own blood. She was poisoning him against the families that had held the kingdom together for 4 centuries. If the Ashbourne line returned, every great house that had risen in those 400 years would lose everything it had built: their lands, their ranks, their throne. Liliana did not have to invent their fear. She only had to name it and stand back and let it do the work that no blade of hers ever could. So the truth, which should have set Leora free, hemmed her in on every side instead. Above her, a court that hated her for what she might take from them. Beside her, a king she no longer knew whether to trust. Behind her, a 400-year theft, with her own name buried at the bottom of it. And somewhere in the dark of the keep, the patient hand that had burned the pages once already was sharpening itself for the moment when whispers would no longer be enough. The blow fell while the king was 3 days' ride from the keep. It was no accident that the elder clans chose that week to send Corvan north to the border, where a dispute over grazing lands had been allowed, encouraged, Maeve would say later, to sharpen into something that demanded a king's own hand. He went, because a king must, and because some part of him still believed that the rule of Varcold held even when he was absent. He learned how wrong he was on the road home from a rider who had nearly killed his horse to reach him. In his absence, Liliana had moved, and she had moved all at once. The elder clans, frightened into unity by the thing she had named to them, declared the waking of the mark a fraud and the servant girl a danger to the realm. They did not need the king's seal. They had the fear of every great house in the kingdom and fear signs faster than any pen. Guardsmen who answered to the clans and not the crown came for Leora before dawn. She did not run. She had nowhere to run to, and some bitter, exhausted part of her had been waiting for exactly this since the morning she had let herself begin to hope. They took her down. Not to a cell in the gatehouse where common offenders waited, but down below the keep into the old ancestral prison cut into the rock beneath the throne hall, the same dark on which the founder's mark was set far above. There they chained her in a cell that had not held a prisoner in living memory. And there she understood they meant her to be forgotten the way the Ashborn had been forgotten once before. Elder Maeve they could not silence so cleanly. She was too well known, too long in her post. So they did to her records what they had done to the founders once already. While Leora sat in the dark below Liliana's people, went through the archive tower with torches and oil and the chronicle of 40 years, the recovered pages, the indexes Siv had hidden every scrap of proof that the Ashborn had ever been more than a nursery tale, went up in a column of smoke that those in the courtyard mistook for a chimney fire. Maeve stood at the foot of the tower and watched her life's work burn and was held back by 2 guardsmen and wept the way the old weep without sound. When the smoke cleared, there was no proof left in the world that Leora was anything but a servant who had bewitched a stone. Only the stone itself remained, and a stone cannot testify in a court of frightened men. Down in the dark, Leora lost the thread of the days. No one came but the hand that pushed bread and water through the slot, and that hand never spoke. She had time, far too much of it, to think. She thought of the room with the window she had been given, and then taken from. She thought of the lamplight in the tower and the king's bowed head across the table, and how easily she had let herself believe in it, and how Liliana had told her exactly how it would end, and had been right. He had not come. The whole weight of the kingdom had decided against her, and the king who had sworn before the whole court to protect her had not come. She did not know he was killing his horse on the north road to reach her. She only knew the dark, and she let it take the last of her faith in the throne, in the truth, in Corvan, in the foolish hope that a girl found in ashes could ever be more than the ashes she was found in. Corvan came through the gates of Varcold at night alone, and filthy, and past the end of his strength, and found a keep that had quietly stopped being his. The guards at the gate were the clansmen now. The court that met him was a court that had already decided he was a king to be managed, not obeyed, a young man bewitched who would thank them later for saving him from himself. Liliana met him on the steps with her face arranged into concern and told him the girl was safe below, only confined only until the matter could be settled. Calmly and surely he could see that the peace of the whole realm, Where is she? Corvan said. It was not a question. Something had changed in him on the road, in the 3 days of riding with his own helplessness, and the men around him heard it even if Liliana for once did not. For his whole reign, he had played the careful king, the warden who kept the balance, who never spent his own weight, because a king who spends it has nothing left to threaten with. He had told himself that caution was wisdom. He saw now, too late, what his caution had cost, that he had been so afraid of risking the throne that he had let them take the only thing he had ever wanted to keep. He stopped being careful. He went down into the dark himself with a dozen guards who were still his own and had ridden north and back at his side and would follow him into worse places than a cellar. He broke the seal on the ancestral prison with his own hands. And when the torchlight found Leora in the last cell, chained and filthy, and turning her face from the light, 'cause she had decided the light only ever came to mock her, he went down on his knees on the wet stone in front of her and broke the chains himself, and could not speak for a moment, and then said only, "I am sorry. I was 3 days away, and it was 3 days too long. I will not be careful with you again." She did not forgive him in that instant. A wound like hers does not close, because the one who let it open finally kneels. But she let him take the irons from her wrists, and she let him bring her up out of the dark, and that was a beginning. What he did next, he did in the full light of the great hall in front of the entire assembled court, with Leora standing beside him and Elder Maeve soot-stained and unbowed on her other side. "You declared her a fraud while I was sent conveniently away," Corvin said. His voice carried to the pillars. "You burned an old woman's life work to leave no answer to the question you were afraid to ask. So I will ask it now where you cannot burn it. If she is nothing, if the mark is a trick, then you lose nothing by letting it speak. And if she is what the stone says she is, then every one of you has spent your whole life bowing to a chair that was never ours to give." Liliana's voice cut across the hall, sharp, now the kindness gone. "And if you are wrong, your majesty, you would stake the throne of your fathers on a coal girl's hand." "I would give the throne of my fathers back to its owner," Corvan said, "if she is its owner. I did not inherit a kingdom to hold a thing that was stolen. If the mark names her, I will set the crown in her hands myself before all of you, and you may call that the end of my house if you like. I call it the first honest act it has done in 400 years. A murmur ran through the hall, and this time it did not all run one way. The guards who had ridden with him drew closer to the dais. An old lord who had loved Corvan's father stepped down from the clan ranks and crossed the floor to stand at the king's side, and then another came after him, and another, until the hall was no longer one frightened crowd, but two, those who had everything to lose if the truth woke, and those who had begun at last to want to hear it. "Then let the stone speak," Corvan said, and he turned to Leora. He did not order her this time. He held out his hand and left the choice where it belonged. "Not for me, not for the throne. For every ash-born soul they put in the fire, so that no one would ever stand where you are standing now. Wake it and let them all see." Leora looked at his open hand and at the great dark mark in the floor, and at the faces of the men and women who had looked through her for the whole of her life. The fear was still in her. So was the cold of the cell. But under both of them, she found something the dark had not managed to take after all, and she walked to the founder's mark, and she knelt, and she laid her bare palm flat against the stone for the third and final time. The mark did not merely light. It opened. Crimson fire raced the channels as before, but it did not stop at the floor or fade as it had faded twice now. It climbed every wall. It filled the seams of the black stone with red, the color of a heart's own blood. And out of that light, the founder's mark gave up at last the thing it had been built, to keep not a fire, but a memory. The founder's magic had stored the truth in the only vault that could not be burned, and now it poured that truth into the open air of the hall for every living witness to see. They saw the founders themselves faint as figures in deep water, the Ashborn, the first line laying their own blood into the stone. They saw the charge given to the wardens who would follow, hold the seat, keep it whole, return it when the blood returns. They saw 412 years gone, the night it was broken. The killing, the fire in the East Village, rekindled across generations, the burning of the pages, the great houses dividing the spoils and writing themselves a cleaner history. And they saw threaded through all of it the shape of a family that had done the breaking, whose name the centuries had polished into respectability. The mark showed the room the truth of where Liliana's own blood had begun, not among the keepers, but among the thieves. There was no defending it. There was nothing in the hall to argue with. The proof was not a page that could be burned, but the founder's own preserved memory blazing on every wall, seen by every eye at once. The elder clans who had stood with Liliana turned and looked at her, and the look was the verdict. Her allies stepped back from her as though she had caught fire. The lie that 400 years and a tower full of ash had been spent to protect was simply finally over, undone not by a blade or an army, but by the truth refusing to stay buried any longer. Liliana stood alone in the red light with the whole of her future cracked open at last, as Leora had stood in that same hall not a season before, bleeding on the floor while the powerful laughed. The wheel had come all the way around. And the girl with no name and no kin and no place in any record rose from the founder's mark with the founder's own memory burning at her back, and for the first time in 412 years, the throne of Varkold looked upon its rightful heir and knew her. The red light faded slowly from the walls of the throne hall, the way a fever breaks, leaving the stone gray and ordinary again, and the air full of the smell of cold iron. But nothing in the room was ordinary now. The court that had spent its whole memory bowing to one truth stood blinking in the aftermath of another, and at the center of it, the servant girl and the Alpha King faced each other across a few feet of black floor that had decided at last whose it was. Corvan did not wait for the silence to be filled with argument. He crossed to where Leora stood, and in front of every lord and clan head and frightened noble still left in the hall, the king of Varkold went down on one knee. Before the Cole girl they had all watched bleed. "The throne is yours," he said. "Not as a gift. A gift would mean it was ever mine to give. It is yours, and it has been yours for 412 years, and my house has only kept it warm." He lifted his head. "I told them I would set the crown in your hands myself. I keep my word." A steward brought the crown of Varkold on a black cloth, and Corvan took it and held it up to her, not placing it, only leaving the last of it to her, as he had learned at last to leave things to her. And Leora looked at the circle of old gold in the hands of the kneeling king and at the faces beyond him, and she did not reach for it. "Stand up," she said quietly. "I have spent my whole life looking at the tops of people's heads while they knelt to be cruel. I will not begin my own reign by looking at the top of yours." He stood. "You ask me to forgive 400 years, she said, and her voice carried because she meant the whole hall to hear it. "I cannot. No one living did those things, and no one living can be made to pay for them. And if I take this crown only to begin the wheel, turning the other way to do to your house what was done to mine, then the Ashborn will have returned for nothing but vengeance, and the founders set their mark in the stone for something better than that." She drew a breath. "I was found in ashes. I was struck over a clasp not a season ago by people who knew exactly what my blood was worth, and the number they named was nothing. They were wrong about the blood. But they were also wrong about something they never thought to measure. And I have learned it the hard way. In this keep, a throne is not held by whose blood you carry. It is held by what you do when no one is making you. The founders did not bind the mark to a bloodline because blood is noble. They bound it to a blood that would not let go of the truth, even when the truth cost everything. She looked then at Corvin, and the last of the frost between them went out of her eyes. "You were 3 days too late," she said, "and you knelt in the dark and told me you would not be careful with me again. A man who carries a borrowed crown for 400 years and then offers it back with his own hands is not a thief. I was angry, and I was right to be angry, and I was also wrong about you, and I am old enough in suffering to be able to say both at once." She took the crown from him and turned and set it back upon his brow. "Be king, not warden, not borrower. King in the open with the truth standing beside you instead of buried under you. Rule the kingdom you actually have. I have no wish to sit a throne alone in a cold hall. I have done cold halls. I would rather build something warmer beside the man who came down into the dark for me." It was not a surrender of her claim. The whole hall understood that, and so did he. It was a choice freely made by the only person with the right to make it, and that was a thing the throne of Varkold had not seen in 4 centuries, a crown held not by inheritance and not by force, but by trust given and returned in the open light. The lords who had loved his father knelt, and then the others, and at last even those who had stood with Liliana, because there was nothing left to stand for. The kingdom that had been 2 frightened crowds an hour before became slowly, in the gray, ordinary light, 1. Liliana was given to the law she had spent her life bending, and the kingdom moved on from her, faster than she would have believed the way a body moves on from a thorn once it is finally drawn. What grew between Leora and Corvin after that grew the way the strongest things grow slowly, with setbacks tested and retested until both of them stopped flinching at the nearness of the other. She did not become a different woman. She still questioned everything. She still could not be told a thing was for her own good without asking who profited. She still, to the endless quiet wonder of the kitchen staff, who had once worked beside her, lifted a fallen coal with her bare hand and felt the heat decide against her. But the dream she had allowed herself in the dark of the servants' quarters, that someone might look at the whole of her and not look away, she did not have to dream any longer. She had only to look across the room. The kingdom called her many things in the years that followed. The Ashborn, the Returned, the girl the throne remembered. She answered to none of them as readily as she answered to her own plain name, the one the old cook had given a foundling with no surname, because she had decided that what a person made of a name mattered more than where the name came from, and she had a kingdom now to prove it to. It might have ended there and ended well. But on the night the founder's mark was finally still, Elder Maeve did not sleep. She so rarely did, and she went down again into the lowest vault of the archive, because a lifetime of records had taught her that a truth uncovered is only the lid lifted off a deeper one. When the mark had blazed full